I'm going to show you how I compose and begin to build a scene on my model railroad on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and today I am beginning what I believe will become one of the signature scenes on my layout. A little over a year ago, I started building an expansion to my existing layout. I had two primary purposes for that expansion. One, to add more industrial space and industrial switching in Saginaw, Texas on the lower deck, and two, to add more open country scenery in between Saginaw and Wichita Falls, Texas on the upper deck. Well, it is that open country scenery that we're going to be working on today. And I'm going to show you where I got inspiration for that scene, how I composed the general elements of it, and the early stages of building out the scene. And we're doing all of that today. Hey, if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. But for now, we're going to head on over to that part of the layout and show you exactly what we have going on. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. Now with 15,000 square feet and one-day shipping, they truly are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. The scene I am composing is in North Texas between Fort Worth and Wichita Falls. I lived in that area for a few years, so I had a rough idea of what I was looking for, but for inspiration I turned to a Google search for images from the area. That search led me to this photograph, which immediately grabbed my attention. This photo was taken by Steve McKelvey, a road rally driver who took the photo in September of 2017. I reached out to Steve in 2021 to ask permission to use the image in this video and discovered that he had sadly and unexpectedly passed away in 2019. His family, however, was gracious to allow me to not only use the image, but were very happy that I asked and that we would honor Steve by the use of this photo for inspiration in this video. Looking at the photo, I note several things that are of modeling interest. First, the star of the photo is the road. Note it is a small highway paved with asphalt with no real shoulders. It was paved long enough ago to be bleached medium gray in the North Texas sun, but not so long ago as to be severely broken up. It does show a few black asphalt lines where cracks have been sealed. Along the road on both sides is an area of tall wild grass of yellow-green and brown hues. Beyond that, on the right is a line of short, scraggly mesquite trees, some living, some standing dead, and some fallen. In the background to the right is the hill, which is a medium-sized hill, very rocky, with a few small bluffs and a lot of broken rocks. Interspersed among the rocks is a great deal of shrubbery and scrubby bushes. Finally, in the distance to the left is a low hill covered in yellow-green grass, possibly with some grazing cows on it. I made specific note of the colors of the grasses, the tree leaves, and the bushes, as well as the various colors in the rocks. All of these elements are great help and are wonderful inspiration for what I want to create in this scene. Here is the space that I'm working with for the scene. I've already roughed in the layers of foam for the hills when I started installing the photo backdrop. Some of these rough layers are glued together, but none of it is glued down to the layout, nor is it carved to shape in any way. The area that I'm working with is from the track to the backdrop, approximately 1 foot deep and 8 feet long. The low flat area adjacent to the track is where the highway will run. I have a plan for how it will curve into the distance and out of sight to the left. The hill to the right will be a rocky hill with mesquite trees and bushes like the one in the photo, and the hill in the very far distance will be the more grassy hill with cattle and a farm scene to the left around the corner. I've also played with the placement of some small rocky bluffs on the hill. Now it's time to start forming the rough scene. First, I roughed in this finger of a ridge from 2-inch foam that will hide where the road curves out of sight. I used a Sharpie to mark the placement of these rock outcroppings and how I want to shape the landforms around them. I also sketched out some of the shapes of the landforms that I wanted to carve. As you plan and perform the shaping of the foam or whatever you use for scenery base, think about real landscape and how it is shaped. Especially think about water runoff and how it shapes hills and landforms. Low areas where water flows in the runoff and washes it away looks natural as it runs downhill, but not so natural if it runs across a hill. Think about how mountains flow into valleys and hills flow into hollows and creeks, and plan for these kinds of shapes in the landscapes that you build. There are a lot of ways to shape foam. Sharp knives and hot wire tools are by far the neatest, but sometimes there is no substitute for the old messy process of carving. One of my favorite tools for carving scenery base from foam is a hacksaw blade. Unmounted, the blade can bend and curve as you carve, and it cuts the foam easily. A second fantastic tool for carving foam is a wood rasp. I love this one, which was flat on one side and curved on the other, as I can carve a variety of shapes with it. Note as I work how the stair-step or wedding cake effect of the stacked foam is disappearing. A small amount of the stair-step effect will look okay and make your scenery varied and interesting, but you want to make most of it disappear in favor of hills that flow downhill and that flow into low areas where the water will run. Here you see the third of my favorite carving tools, a Surform rasp. I have a 10-inch Surform rasp that's great for working in large areas, but this small 4-inch one is my go-to when it comes to shaping most of my scenery. Now, carving foam in this manner is messy, so you'll want to protect nearby models from the shavings, and you'll want to stop and vacuum your mess often. The fourth and final of my favorite carving tools, apart from hot wire tools, is this breakaway linoleum knife. Now, at this moment, I had mislaid my knife, so you'll see me using a spare blade from it to carve the foam, but you'll see the knife itself later in the video. These 4 tools are the best for shaping foam, in my opinion. If you'd like to check them out, I'll list all 4 of them in my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description down below. When the hills have taken a fair shape, I glued them to the foam base of the layout with a foam-safe glue. Make sure your adhesive is foam-safe, otherwise it will attack and eat away the foam. Liquid nails for projects works well for this, but it takes a while to cure. I personally like Styro Goo from Hotwire Foam Factory. It secures in 30 minutes so I can keep working, and it fully cures in about 12 hours. I apply beads of the adhesive all over the foam and push it firmly into the base on the layout, then weigh it down firmly for 30 minutes to an hour. I retrieved these 10-pound cast weights from an old weight machine that a friend was scrapping. They are perfect for weighing down projects like this while adhesive cures. You may have noticed in the interim that I applied a layer of waxed paper between these hills and the backdrop, securing it to the backdrop with small pieces of painter's tape. This will protect my backdrop from plaster, paint, glue, and other scenery materials while I work in this area. I applied it before the glue on the hills had tacked so I could tuck it behind the hills. In this low area, I intend to model a culvert, probably in the form of a couple of corrugated pipes. In preparation for that, I cut out the area along the fascia where the culvert would drain with a knife blade. I then test fit some lengths of thin drinking straw, which will become the drain pipes. I glued the rock castings into place with low-temp hot glue, which works great for dissimilar materials like plaster to foam. Don't use high-temp glue with the larger glue sticks as it will melt the foam. I had a few voids between pieces of foam, so I filled these with wadded paper and covered them with painter's tape. I needed a few larger rock castings for a cut through which the track will travel, and for that finger ridge that I was working on earlier. I had a cast rock that I had produced as an illustration for a video some time ago. It was far too large for any one of these areas, but if cut, it would work for all three castings. I cut it from the back with a razor saw until I could snap it in two. I test fit these castings and hot glued them to the foam as well. When I was satisfied with the shape of the hills and the rock castings, it was time to cover the foam with plaster cloth. In the past, I have used plaster of Paris and paper towels for this because plaster cloth was pretty expensive. But more recently, there are a variety of companies offering plaster cloth, and its costs have come down significantly. So I buy it in bulk and use it for applications like this. I'll also drop a link to the plaster cloth in my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description. I cut strips of plaster cloth that generally fit the contour of the hills for a section, cutting around the rock castings. I then stack the strips up in the order that I will apply them, and I use a long narrow container with about a half an inch of water in it to activate the plaster. In my case, I'm using the lid off of an old plastic pencil box one of my kids used in school years ago. Holding the strip of plaster cloth taut, I simply dip it in and slowly drag it through the water, getting it just wet enough to activate the plaster. I then lay it in place and smooth it out to my satisfaction. Around the rock castings, I like to pull the edge of the plaster cloth just onto the edge of the rock. Having just started to apply the plaster cloth, I realized one important thing I had forgotten: to protect the track. So I stopped and covered it with painter's tape. I overlapped the strips of plaster cloth by about half an inch for good coverage. Smooth the seams down as well as possible to avoid ridge lines. In the past, I have tried to rub the plaster cloth to fill in all of the holes in the gauze material, but I have a new way of doing this now that you'll see in just a few moments. I let the plaster cloth dry and harden, which only takes a couple of hours. Then I sculpted around the edges of the rock castings and some other features with Sculptamold. I like to mix my Sculptamold thick, almost like a paste, but in small batches. I apply it with a popsicle stick or with my fingers. I keep a bowl of water handy, as wetting my fingers allows me to smooth the application as I get them into shape. Around these small rock castings, I use the Sculptamold to further shape the hill into a believable feature where a rock outcropping might exist. I also fill in all the gaps around the sides and the top of the rocks. The road in this scene will be the subject of a video all its own, but I did need to make some preparations for the road. There's a small ridge here that the road will travel over, and the road needs to build up to the track level for a grade crossing. So I filled this area for the road with some craft foam. It is thin and flexible and easy to cut. It took 2 layers to get the area for the road built up to the level where I needed it. I simply glued it down with PVA, in my case Elmer's glue wall, and tacked it in place with push pins while it dried. When that glue had dried, I contoured the edges into the scene with some more Sculptamold. Once everything so far had dried, I covered the gauze material and any ridges and imperfections with a thin layer of plaster of Paris. I mixed this plaster in very small batches and very thin, almost a liquid consistency. I then brushed it on with a cheap applicator brush. If any areas needed further smoothing, while the plaster was still damp, I used a bit of water on the ends of my fingers and simply rubbed it gently to smooth it out. The plaster sets up pretty quickly, especially on top of the plaster cloth, So in an hour or so, I gently sanded any rough spots with a 180 grit sanding sponge, then vacuumed up all the dust and debris. At this point, I allowed everything to dry and cure overnight before moving on to the next step. That next step is painting. At this stage, I wanted to paint the ground generally with some basic browns. Dirt is generally lighter in color than we tend to think, and my reference photo shows that the ground and the rocks in this area is a fairly light tan. That said, I painted the ground here in 2 stages. The first was a milk chocolate color. I used an inexpensive craft paint for this, as I often do for scenery. This first color is Apple Barrel Paint's Territorial Beige. It's darker than I would want my ground to be, but again, I'm going to be applying a second coat. I applied this paint full strength and worked it into the plaster to try to make sure that all of the crevices received paint and none remained white. When that color was fully applied, I immediately started to paint the entire area again with Apple Barrel Khaki, which I watered down to about 2 parts water to 1 part paint. This step lightened the ground to the color near what I wanted it to be, but left a lot of variation in the color where the darker browns showed through. I should say that I was not overly careful with the painting at this step because this base color, honestly, very little of it will show once the scene is finished. The final step for this part of the process is coloring the rocks. There are many ways to realistically color rocks, but I like to use water-based washes made from the same type of craft paint that I used for the ground. My reference photo shows, and anyone familiar with North Texas knows, that there is a fair amount of red in the rocks and the soil of that part of the world. This color is an undertone, so I start with it when coloring the rocks. For this color, I used Apple Barrel Chestnut. All of these washes are going to be about 1 part paint to 6 or 7 parts water. I simply flood the rock casting until it is completely covered. This one rock had been previously painted gray, but I simply stain over it knowing that it was going to have a slightly different final tint than the others, but that's okay as it'll add a little variety to the scene. Allow each layer of wash to completely dry before adding another, as you otherwise can wash away the previous layer. My next wash was with the khaki. This is the more prominent general color of the rocks in the reference photo. Note how, even while wet, the 2 colors blend in different ways to create a variety of color. A few areas received no khaki wash at all and are very red. Some received a little khaki, and others are almost completely covered with the khaki. I applied multiple coats of the khaki as I wanted it to be the more prominent color than the red. Take time to manage areas where too much paint pools up or where you find air bubbles. These can hurt your final finish. After these basic colors are dry, I bring out the detail with a black wash. Personally, I like to use India ink for this. I add a tablespoon of India ink into a pint of 70% isopropyl alcohol, and I find that that works really, really well, and that pint will last for many years. Be very careful with this solution, however, as whatever it touches will be permanently stained black. I apply a general wash to the entire surface with a foam brush and let it seep into the cracks and crevices and run down the rocks. I soak up any pools of ink with the edge of a paper towel. The ink will darken the rock castings as it dries, but we will fix that in the next step. When the India ink dries, the rock is looking pretty good, but it is a little bit dark for my taste. I lighten it and bring out some highlights with a light color and a dry brushing technique. Dry brushing means that I load my brush with a little bit of paint, brush most of it off on a paper towel, Then apply the remaining paint in light strokes that just hit the higher points of the work. In this case, I wanted to lighten the rocks significantly, so I applied several applications of the dry brushing until they lightened to the shade that I wanted. Be careful here not to use too much paint at once, as it will obliterate the black shading in the crevices and the variety of color that you achieved through the washes. So here is our project at this point. I will save ground cover, grass, trees, shrubs, and the road for future videos. Well, I think that is plenty for one video, but I hope you see how one good photograph can provide incredible inspiration for a great scene on your layout. In future videos on this project, I'm going to show you even more about how I crafted this scene after that inspiration photo to create a beautiful, realistic open country scene for my layout. Be sure to watch for that, and also be sure to check out those items that I mentioned in the Amazon Pick of the Week, as well as the other great links in the description down below. And for more scenery building techniques and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. And be sure and join me on Tuesdays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?